quarter. We've tried to color code it to give you a sense, and the presentation here focuses solely on those that are below the 100% performance and those that are above. So we have at the 150% mark. So we have not included those that are deemed to have been achieved in terms of indicators. Now, this particular fourth quarter report also has to be understood in its particular context. So not only the entire strategic plan, but in this particular context, that in the fourth quarter, we were already busy preparing, as the committee knows, for the new financial year. And understanding that 2020-21 was bringing with it already budget cuts for us as a department, and this committee would have seen that when the budget and the APP was tabled and approved for 2021, there were already projects that were then on the go in 1920 and in the fourth quarter that would have been impacted by decisions taken to then potentially halt those projects as subsequent phases. There was also then decline in the business confidence and obviously the increasing insolvencies and the business rescue applications within the construction industry that we were dealing with and had to respond to. Then prior to the lockdown that occurred right at the end, so in the last week of March, we already as a department started to go through a process to try and mitigate some of the COVID aspects, COVID-19 aspects, and the aspects of suppression in order to decongregate it. So started a process of decongregating our business, our department, our offices, and understanding, driving a process of people being able to work from home, work remotely, etc. And then some of our projects, or strangely enough, of course, do end up being impacted by the global challenges. So when China were on lockdown, and then even when they started to open up, our LIFT program in the general infrastructure portfolio and even the replacement lifts in the Department of Health program that we were required to deliver on actually met with challenges because the lifts couldn't be shipped out of China. They were either stuck in the manufacturers or then couldn't then be loaded onto the necessary boats to be shipped to South Africa. So that's just one example where globally we may not have been on lockdown yet from a South African perspective, but globally, of course, we were impacted. Then this is just to give you an overall sense of each of the budget programs with the preliminary fourth quarter performance. And the various budget programs in terms of where we haven't achieved the numbers of performance targets, programs 2 and 3 particularly. So overall as a department, there were 14 of our performance indicators from a preliminary perspective that were not achieved, so sitting between 0 and 49%. 18 of them partially, 20 fully achieved, and then 5 overachieved. And I'll take you through, as I mentioned, the over and then the partial or not achieved in the subsequent slides and provide you with an indication of the rationale or the reasons behind it. So if we first start on Program 1 Administration, I just thought we'd include a couple of graphics. Otherwise, listening to my voice and seeing graphs all the time can be rather boring. In the quarter, of course, the department awarded new bursaries, the Masaki Sizwe students' bursaries, 127 of them awarded for youngsters to study in the engineering and build sector professions. And at the time, then we also had a number of pay interns as well. In the Program 1 budget program, in terms of the 2 indicators, one substantially overachieved and the other underachieved, I can indicate here that the overachievement was in relation to the number of commitments signed. So that's linked to the Masaki Sizwe bursary program, the commitments signed with the private sector, with municipalities and others. And we actually had a target of 10 and we achieved 35. So that's companies and organizations that partner with us in the bursary program. And then where we haven't fully achieved the target was in dealing with the number of integrated transport plans and assessing the ITPs from the municipalities. So as a department, we support the West Coast, the Central Karoo and the Overberg districts by actually project managing and undertaking their integrated transport plans on their behalf, so with them, but we appoint the project managers and support those processes directly. While in the other municipalities, of course, excluding the city, we provide funding to those municipalities for them to undertake the integrated transport plan themselves. And that obviously then means that they have to try to make sure, based upon the funds that we transfer, that they are spent, and generally then their financial year, as we know, carries over different to ours. So there is a delay in terms of the timing of them between ourselves and the relevant municipalities. If I move to Program 2, which is the Public Works team in terms of infrastructure, there's just a graphic of a high school that was completed. And then this is where we start seeing some of the red, unfortunately, in terms of the numbers. And some of that is on the back of the fact that the reporting system for EPWP, in terms of the work opportunities and the full-time equivalents, of course, is run nationally. And we are still awaiting the final system-generated reports. So also, there is a delay in terms of the capturing of data because certain sites, of course, shut down before the end of March on the back of the national lockdown under stage 5. So some of that information hasn't yet pulled through in the process. And that's why I pointed out that it's very important you understand that these are preliminary numbers. If we move to subprogram 2.3 on the construction side, the number of infrastructure projects that were ready for tender, the designs that were ready for tender, this has been impacted particularly by rescoping of projects, which obviously then means that the tenders are delayed. When our clients, when educational health need a project rescoped, when they are not happy with the estimate that we come up with, there's a process called value engineering where we try to then relook at the designs before we go out to tender, and therefore that delayed a number of them. Then the number of capital infrastructure projects completed within the agreed time period, you see there's 70%, so 7 out of the target of 10. There have been a number of instances, as I mentioned, as far as contractor underperformance. So there has been then extensions of time granted, and that means that carries over into the new financial year. Obviously, where any contractor is late in terms of the contract, penalties are applied as per the contract provisions. If I then look at the capital infrastructure projects completed within the agreed budget, so that's 8 of the 10 for the quarter. And in this instance, there are aspects where the scope is adjusted, and then in a couple of instances, particularly, there was unforeseen circumstances where the Eskom connection and additional services were found during excavation for the foundation of a site. So the one was a delay in the Eskom connection, and the other was where there were additional services identified when they were excavating for the foundation. And as a result, the projects were not completed within the agreed budget that was set. The number of capital projects completed then in total, 16 of the 21, and there particularly we've found that there have been on some of our sites, as the committee would be aware from previous interactions, issues around the contractor performance, and then obviously also in some instances matters with the community that cause a delay in terms of the completion of the projects. The final point about the number of jobs created through the construction projects, this committee would recall when we tabled the annual performance plan for this year, as well as our strategic plan, we briefed the committee about the aspects of the different approach and different definitions provided now for the numbers of jobs, which came out as a result of the audit process of 2018-19. If you recall, when we presented also on the annual report for 2018-19. If we had been allowed in the process to actually change the target that was included in this APP, I can indicate that we actually would have achieved 67% of this particular target for the quarter, and overall 94% in terms of the year-to-date numbers. On the maintenance side, the number of planned maintenance projects awarded, quite close at 89%. Here there has been also time lost as far as definitions are concerned and challenge where there's been deferred maintenance. And we've needed to adjust the numbers of projects where budget needs to be adjusted and understanding the implications carrying through into the new financial years, or when the operational requirements then needed us to adjust our focus. That then also means that the number of planned maintenance projects completed within the agreed contract period is 30 of the 44. And there, in the main, the reasons cited are around the aspects of underperformance and the failure to meet contractual obligations. And then we have also, where necessary, we've received additional work requirements from the users or the clients that have required some variations to the project that was originally specified. Then the number of projects completed within the agreed budgets, similar in terms of previous reasoning, and then exactly the same in terms of the jobs created. And I can indicate that on this particular one, if we had been able to adjust the target for this quarter, we would have actually achieved 147%. So we would have overachieved on what we had, what would have been the case in terms of the actual target, and we would have been 147% year to date. In terms of the immovable asset management team, the number of projects, properties that we acquired, we actually ended up, from a preliminary number point of view, acquiring 25 properties compared to the original target of 10. And this was actually as a result of a number of the primary healthcare facilities being transferred free to or gratis to the province. And the point, therefore, that we have overperformed. It looks as though there's zero performance in terms of the percentage of electricity consumption reduction in the last quarter, and that is because we didn't reduce our electricity consumption. Unfortunately, the electricity consumption actually increased, and it was as a result of us having implemented measures that obviously replaced a number of our water, our cooling systems in our buildings that were obviously reliant on water in terms of water cooling, air conditioning, and others. And with the drought and the need to respond from a water point of view in the previous years, those were replaced with dry cooler fans. We replaced diesel boilers with heat pumps. And we installed circulation pumps for grey and potable water systems, and so on. And that obviously then meant that our electricity consumption did actually increase. From a mitigation point of view, in this particular aspect, obviously we do intend to continue implementing and installing wherever possible low carbon sources of supply. For example, the solar water heaters, the rooftop solar PV on buildings where it makes financial sense, and obviously to continue to drive an energy efficiency program through the provincial government and through our users in terms of our office portfolio. The last one, in terms of the number of condition assessments conducted on state-owned buildings, if you look back into previous years, we'd actually overperformed because we reduced the turnaround time in terms of the cycle. By law, we are required to do a condition assessment of every state-owned building over a period of 5 years, and we actually concertinaed that into a 2-year accelerated cycle, so that we had better up-to-date information about the condition of the portfolio in order to respond accordingly. And again, because the target couldn't be adjusted, that shows as an underperformance. If I move to Program 3, the transport infrastructure side, just to show you the N7 Dunoon, the N7 roads project, that team is back on site now. In terms of the road side of things, I can indicate that the number of kilometers of gravel roads upgraded to surface standards obviously has been overperformed, and that is really because there were projects that were rescheduled with the district municipality doing some of that work on our behalf. The full-time equivalents we had overperformed on in terms of work created. but not been successful in terms of the number of youths employed on the project or the number of women employed. And again, that's linked to, for us, a disruption in terms of the reporting numbers and the reporting system as a result of the COVID lockdown. So we were unable to draw that information from the sites that was necessary in order for us to be able to complete this report. So that will be updated now as the teams are back on site, and we are able to then get to validated numbers post this process. The maintenance side of things, the number of square meters of surfaced roads that have been rehabilitated. In this instance, it shows as a 0, also because that the two projects that are linked to this, it's the Oudtshoorn de Rust Road of 152,000 square meters and the Vredenburg Paternoster Road of 110,000 square meters, are both practically complete. But due to the lockdown period, the certificate, the completion certificates obviously would have been delayed. And we take the completion certificate as the proof that we need to in terms of the portfolio of evidence in order to conclude the reporting. And therefore, the target will be achieved in terms of that particular indicator, but we are unable to report on it from a preliminary point of view because we do not have the portfolio of evidence from a completion certificate perspective. The number of square meters, therefore, of surface roads resealed also fits under the Oudtshoorn de Rust project. The Robertson Bonnievale project of 560,000 square meters is also practically complete, but the same issue with the completion certificate. And then the Worcester Verleersdorp Langhoogte project of 300,300 square meters that was scheduled to be completed in the second quarter has not been completed because of a failure from that particular contractor. The contract we had to terminate, and therefore that particular target, overall annual target, will not be achieved. The number of kilometers of gravel roads re-gravelled, here we have got a problem, as we have said before to the committee, about accessing the borrow pits, and the re-gravelling material is for us a constant issue to try to respond to and find solutions for. We did make progress just before and through to lockdown as well in terms of dealing with the provincial bank around the necessary guarantees that are required to be provided to the appropriate national department. So I do hope that in the next month or so, this particular matter will be resolved for some time to come. The blacktop patching and obviously the gravel roads bladed are all preliminary and subject to the data that we need to receive from the districts. And we'll do so obviously after the lockdown process and as we start getting the necessary information as those teams return to site. On the transport operations side, Chair, just again some graphics in terms of the work around the team, particularly under the COVID side, where we've been looking at trying to make sure, as far as possible, aspects around the requirements of public transport are adhered to. As you know, in the previous financial year, and we've continued with money on the budget for the current financial year to support, in collaboration with the city and PRASA, the Rail Enforcement Unit, and these were just some of the details that came through, which are then not captured in specific performance indicators per se, but obviously are very useful to understand what has been achieved as a result of the funds that have been appropriated or were appropriated to the department. If I can then move on to Programme 4, the transport operations and the public transport services side of things. Here you see the number of routes subsidized, number of kilometers subsidized, and trips subsidized. They're all awaiting the validation of data, which again was not able to occur during the original lockdown period. So that we anticipate will be resolved obviously as we go through the validation process. And the road safety awareness campaigns, only one out of the three, because there were actually two campaigns scheduled, one for the 26th and one for the 27th of March in Laingsburg and in Beaufort West. But because of the national lockdown, of course, they then did not materialize. And that therefore will remain an underperformance in this particular program. On the transport regulation side, that's just some graphics, and obviously some of the feedback from the festive season in terms of that was just before and into the beginning of the final quarter of the financial year in terms of the performance of provincial traffic, and then some of the junior traffic training centres that were opened within the garden route. Then in terms of two aspects specifically under transport regulation, the Transport Administration and Licensing, the compliance inspections conducted, there was a resignation of one of our inspectors, and therefore that obviously impacted on the achievement of the target. And of course now, from a financial point of view and the COE limitations and impact from a government overall, we're not yet certain that we will be able to fill that particular post from a priority perspective, but that is something that we are working on at the moment. In terms of the PRE and the hearings, one of the transport regulation officers unfortunately experienced trauma herself, and therefore was unable to complete the work that had been allocated to her, and therefore we do unfortunately have an underperformance on this particular target. If I then look at the law enforcement side, the number of vehicles weighed, vehicles stopped and checked, very close to the 100% performance, and the schools involved in the road safety education program. Of course, the weigh bridges themselves, as you would understand, were closed over the festive season, so that did impact the number of vehicles weighed, because we did ultimately then need to redeploy our teams. And there was, from what I was, in terms of some of the rationale or feedback, some unexpected load shedding at a couple of the stations, which then meant that the teams were obviously not able to weigh all of the vehicles as they had originally targeted. The vehicle stopped and checked is slightly below what the target was. We did see an increase during this quarter of the number of escorts that the provincial traffic team had to do for the windmill towers of abnormal loads, and that meant then that our teams are redeployed from their normal vehicle checkpoints and roadblock duties in terms of escort duties, and then obviously the road safety education program. We had actually overperformed in the previous quarter, and then obviously just shows a underperformance in this quarter, but overall for the department we will have achieved that target for the annual allocation. Then Chair, finally, government motor transport. In terms of GMT, the number of policy and guideline circulars is ultimately a demand-driven type of indicator, as is the number of vehicle inspections that are carried out, and therefore there's an underachievement compared to what was identified based upon previous years that we see is done, and then we estimate what we'd be looking at for the year in question. The outstanding debt is an interesting one that you see here. Obviously, the actual figure is sitting at 106.9 million compared to a target of 64. And this is ultimately due to COVID and to the lockdown. The GMT officials were ultimately then unable to contact and follow up with a number of the clients, the client institutions, to obtain the necessary information that they needed about the payments received, so that they could undertake the necessary reconciliations. So at that point, the reconciliation was only at 52%. And obviously, we are then following through that as a result in terms of post-lockdown. The debt from outstanding previous years is less than what the target was, which is excellent in terms of clients then settling their outstanding debt with GMT. Then the number of misuse complaints, as well as crashes and losses and third-party claims, are also all ultimately demand-driven. On the misuse complaints, fewer complaints, we like to believe, then reflects an improved driver behavior, and that ultimately it means that the systems that we're putting in place to respond to misuse and notifications around misuse of the GMT fleet are actually bearing fruit. Ideally, we would love to see zero misuse complaints coming through to the GMT hotline. And then crashes and losses, of course, that does mean hopefully therefore that the drivers are being more careful and that we don't have those types of losses occurring. And then finally, the third-party claims as well, Chair. Chair, with that, if I may say thank you very much. Myself and my team will do our best to answer the questions that you and the committee may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, HOD, for the presentation. Members, I'm going to ask you to, we're going to go straight into the question session now. If you could please indicate to me by a show of your hands on the toolbar, raise your hands in the toolbar, on the toolbar, and I'll give you an opportunity. Can I please ask that you, for the record, just state your name, because we didn't do the introductions in the beginning. So if you could just state your name before posing your questions. So I've seen Honourable van der Westhuizen, Honourable Mvimbi, Honourable America, and Honourable Heron. Right, Honourable van der Westhuizen.
Thank you, Chair. I trust you can hear me. Chair, a number of questions. The first one refers to page 18 of the presentation and the explanation regarding the increase of electricity consumption. And I was wondering whether we could get a little bit more detail there, because in general, you know, we've made great strides to become more energy aware and also to be more effective. How many of these, for example, diesel-driven hot water systems were replaced by electrical systems? And if I may then ask, why not solar geysers, which seem to be the way to go in terms of our high electricity prices? Then I think it was, the slide was marked paragraph 2.4. I don't have the page number there. In terms of maintenance work, it seems to me as if in general, with a vast portfolio of properties, that the demands on maintenance is extremely high and linked to vandalism, etc., as if, you know, the number of maintenance tasks that will need to be undertaken should actually be much higher. So if you could just comment on that. The same with the assessment of the condition of buildings, where you've said you've actually accelerated those assessments. Surely the last 2 years haven't been the first where we've done assessments of buildings and maintenance needs, etc. And therefore the underperformance seemed to be strange to me. When we come to the transport part, number of kilometers for gravel upgrade, and then it says 8. Is it 8 kilometers? Surely, you know, I forgive my ignorance, but I need some more clarity on that. Same with the slide on page 23, where I thought that, you know, the targets and the performance both seem to be quite low. And then when it comes to roadblocks, I'm really grateful to see, for example, over the last few months also that the frequency of roadblocks have increased. But during our oversight visit in the Karoo, we've actually noticed that there's a lack of cooperation from, for example, the police dog unit or the Cape Nature environmental inspectors, etc. If you could just tell us what would be the possibilities to also involve them themselves. And then the last one, Chair, regarding the outstanding debt, where it seems as if we've really overperformed. Now, you know, your outstanding debt is influenced also by amounts that you write off as irrecoverable. Now, can I just ask, have you written off any irrecoverable debt in the last year, and how has that influenced our performance in terms of outstanding debt? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honourable van der Westhuizen. Honourable Mvimbi.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Mine is really just two questions. The first one, just on issues of the properties in the report, the HOD has indicated that out of the target of 10 that they wanted to acquire, there's about 25 that they've acquired. Were these properties, is it land or is it building? And secondly, were they bought or do we get them for free or were they expropriated? That's one on the properties. The second question is, I've note the report that is on COVID-19. It was actually it was just really one bullet point, if not 2 bullet points, and noting that we are actually 2 months into this period of the pandemic. I really would have loved some report as to how we have actually dealt with some of the challenges that are relevant to the department. For example, the issue of public transport and how that has been monitored during this phase. I know it might have not been part of the annual report of part of the performance. It's something that happened, but I know for a fact that the department has been very much involved. It would have been good if we could have actually also get an insight as to how have the department dealt with this challenge, so that if we don't get that kind of report, it means that we are still going on as usual. We are actually it's business as usual, whereas we know that the pandemic has really changed that. We are actually faced with a new reality that at some point we needed to juggle and change around. I just also wanted to check from the department to what extent have they been affected by the COVID in terms of their performance and how they have actually have to change some of their programs so that they can adjust to dealing with the pandemic. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honourable Mvimbi. Honourable America.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, members. Thank you, Ms. Gooch, for the presentation. Just about 3 questions I'd like to ask. One being, I see the categorization of the levels of achievements have been sort of categorized in basically 4 categories, namely not achieved, partially achieved, achieved, and overachieved. It's like, you know, creating a category that, yeah, it's, for me, doesn't really make sense. You know, you either achieved it, there's no, and you partially achieved it, I can understand that. And we don't set ourselves out to overachieve. We set the criteria to such an extent that we're able to achieve it or not. Whether we've overachieved it, that's a bonus. But be that as it may, Honourable van der Westhuizen, you know, dealt with a question that I wanted to ask, namely, is the GMT, and that relates to the outstanding debts. And I think that what I would like to know about that, in addition to what Honourable van der Westhuizen has asked, in terms of, for me, it would appear that let me just get to the slide quickly. Yeah, the outstanding debt for all previous financial years, there's a target of 7,200,000 rand, and there's a percentage actual achievement of 281%. I don't quite fully understand what that basically means. So maybe I can just get a further explanation with regard to that. Then furthermore, if we move over to the next slide, is the number of complaints, misuse complaints processed, and the number of crashes and losses incidents processed. Now, the question that I'd like to ask with regard to the number of misuse complaints processed is that it's a target of 280, and the actual complaints processed were 112. Now, which is 40% of the 280 target. Now, it's like having sort of a maintenance budget, in my view, is that we target X amount for maintenance, and the more we achieve the target, the better it is for us. It's an indication that we are fully maintaining our assets under our control. Now, with regard to that 40%, it's an inverse relationship between the target. But the lower the percentage, the better it is. So, yeah, it's just I can't fully wrap my mind around it, and maybe the HOD can just re-explain that particular sort of targets for me, please. And lastly, Chair, is that, and I'm moving back to the number of jobs that were created, in particular, and I don't know if it is related to the lockdown that was sort of declared on the 15th March, but there's a significant amount of EPW jobs and FTE jobs that were not created. Is there a relationship between the number of infrastructure projects completed and the inability of these EPW jobs or FTE equivalent jobs that weren't created, because it's quite significant? And then lastly, Chair, is that the 33% of infrastructure designs that were completed in the last term. What's the progress in terms of the completion of those? What possibility exists for those designs to be completed within the first term of the new financial year? Thank you, Chair. I'll stop there now.
Thank you, Honourable America. Honourable Heron.
Thanks, Chair. I'll start where Honourable America was leading off with regards to the number of jobs created. I think there's two parts to my question. First of all, I assume that the Department of Transport and Public Works is only reporting the EPWP jobs that arise directly out of its own projects and budget. But even still, I found both the target and then the poor achievement against the target quite low. And I wonder why the targets were so low, given the extent of the infrastructure budget that lies within the Department of Transport and Public Works. I would have expected that there would be a higher EPWP job component of those infrastructure projects, and I would have expected the target to be higher. Of course, that doesn't help with the achievement, which I think is also way too low. So I wonder if the HOD can comment on the low target, which to me it seems low, and I think she did already address the relatively poor achievement against the target. I also, I mean, at the beginning of the presentation, the HOD raised the COVID-19 epidemic and the lockdown and some of the impact that may have had on performance. But I think it would be useful to just understand whether in those last weeks of March, whether there were shifts within the department as it started to realize its role in providing quarantine and isolation sites, and how that impacted on the performance in the fourth quarter. And then finally, still staying with COVID-19 and the assessment of the performance and transport services, I do want to take the opportunity, because we're not going to get it again before the 1st of June, to find out whether the department is working on capacity constraints within the public transport network in the province, but in particular, I guess, in George and in Cape Town, where there is the department is involved. How are we going to address capacity constraints as people go back to work from the 1st of June? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Heron. HOD, I know that that's quite a lot of questions, but I'm going to, with your indulgence, allow Honourable Nkondlo to pose her questions as well, so that we can conclude round one.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm covered by Member Heron and Member America, I think, on the jobs question. The other question I wanted to check with the bursary and the interns, understanding that the objective that the department always places here is a contribution towards, your construction-related skills of this particular bursary. Can I just understand what exactly is the process once these bursars complete their courses, including these interns? Are there any facilitated exit strategies by the department, or the skills sort of a program that I think is either located in the Department of Economic Development or Premier? Can I just understand how are these sort of filtered back into the economy in a much more deliberate way? My second question is that if we look at what the HOD spoke about, I think it's in slide 18 about the challenge of the electricity containment. I think I would want to understand, what does this mean also in as far as our broad objective of one, driving your alternative energy, as the provincial government with this particular department, leading such. Secondly, in ensuring that indeed we demonstrate, with evidence that, moving or bringing in multi-sources of energy beyond electricity, is the way to go. If, with this particular result, I'm just interested to understand what then does it mean to those particular objectives that we always mention. And then the other one, Chair, is that I'm very concerned in slide 21 about the challenge of the job performance, which indicates, I think, level of poor numbers or an inability to realize the targets for youth and women. And I want HOD to explain to me what is the cause of this, because I think there is a lot of data that has demonstrated how this group of youth and women are the most vulnerable. What exactly are the problems?
Thank you, Honourable.
Of realizing the target set.
Honourable Nkondlo, you're breaking up.
Okay, Chair, I hear you cutting me by saying thank you, so I'm stopping there if my time is up.
No, your time is not up. I thought you were finished because you just disappeared. So if you could just repose that last question, because I don't think that the HOD Honourable Nkondlo,
and can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yes, on slide 21, I was asking if HOD can give a sense about what are the challenges of realizing targets for youth and women as the vulnerable groups. And the last one is on the REU, that is the program we've been contributing to, in Metro Rail. What has been the cost that we had spent in as far as supporting those particular activities? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Nkondlo. HOD, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the members for the questions posed. I will do my best to respond. I may then call on some of my colleagues to assist if you're okay with that. And I will try and make sure. I apologize. I've got some documents with me, so my voice may go a little bit softer as I turn my head to check on the various documents. So if I can start with the Honourable van der Westhuizen's questions, and I'm ultimately going to work from the bottom up, if you don't mind. On the GMT and the questions about the outstanding debt, no debt has been written off in terms of the numbers indicated there for the year that was mentioned. It's all in terms of what had then ultimately been recovered from the clients or paid for by the clients. So there is no written off debt in 1920 that has been indicated in that presentation. On the roadblocks, I can understand the point about the lack of cooperation. I think it's for that reason why the team, and they've presented to this committee previously, started a process of the concepts of district safety plans as well, which is a process to try and build the buy-in from various role players when we're looking at responding to road safety matters, so that when you do focus on the enforcement E of the 4 E's of road safety, you're then ultimately able to make sure that you have the Cape Nature teams or the SAPS units, etc., that are then fully committed and working with us from a provincial traffic perspective. So obviously the team always do work to try to bring in other role players so that we have got integrated roadblocks. It does, I think, add tremendous value to us in terms of the work that is done across the law enforcement agencies. I do also think, actually, that COVID and the response to COVID has been a positive one in bridging and building strong relationships with SAPS, for example, and other law enforcement agencies. So I do hope, while COVID is obviously a horrendous pandemic that we're having to respond to, there are opportunities within it that we must seize and work. And just as Member Mvimbi, Honourable Member Mvimbi, you raised the point about doing things differently and the new normal, for me, this is one of those particular aspects. The number of kilometres of gravel roads upgraded, the target for that particular quarter in terms of the item was 8. So the Honourable Member van der Westhuizen is correct. There was 8 kilometres for that particular quarter in terms of what was being produced. And remember, that's because it's done with the district municipalities in terms of the road teams. So it's not a massive contractor coming in and completing the work. This is done on the basis that also helps to build skills, build capability, and so on, back into the roads units, that I think is vitally important. So the number is correct in terms of the 8. It's also important to know that we are well aware in our systems in the road asset management plan and what we put into our strategic and annual performance plans each year show that there's a far greater demand than what we can respond to in terms of numbers of kilometers of roads that actually do meet the criteria for upgrading from gravel to surface standard. But we just don't have the financial resources to be able to actually do that. So each year we have to identify a couple of roads in terms of the length that we can afford, and that can be fitted into the budget, while still obviously then focusing on the core aspects of maintaining the core part of the network that carries the kind of volumes that the provincial network does. The questions that you then raised about the numbers of properties that are assessed in terms of the underperformance part. Again, if I may reiterate that these are obviously then the 4th quarter performance in terms of the report. And on the basis that in previous years, so in the previous year, before when this particular annual performance plan was put on the table, and obviously that was before the final year was completed, we had increased that 5-year cycle. So every building is assessed over a 5-year cycle. So within that 5-year cycle, we had increased the proportion of properties that we assessed in the previous year. And as a result, then there's an underperformance in this particular fourth quarter in terms of the year. On the maintenance side, you're quite right in terms of projects. Potentially, the demands are quite high, particularly when it comes to aspects around vandalism and others. If I recall correctly, this is scheduled maintenance in terms of a target. This isn't then emergency maintenance that comes across in the numbers and the targets that are set, because of course that is fundamentally demand driven. So the numbers here in the targets are on the basis of scheduled maintenance programs that are planned based upon the budgets that are available at that particular time when the performance plan is set and obviously the financial year is set. And then finally, the question about the electricity, and it came up on a couple of aspects. Obviously, I don't sit here with the numbers of geysers and things like that and heat pumps that have been installed. We can gather that information for you. But certainly, I would like to make sure that the committee understands that we have, in terms of our targets, of course, for reducing electricity consumption over the years, we have performed incredibly well. And that's all contained within the property efficiency report that we've previously presented and made available to the committee. You might recall that, and I can certainly provide again a copy to you where that captures the types of interventions and the work that we have put in place to ensure that we have reduced the electricity consumption. So we actually achieved the 5-year target in the 4th year, if I recall correctly. And then you just see in this quarter, we were not able to report a further reduction in terms of what we had previously reported upon. If I may then move to the questions that were posed by Honourable Member Mvimbi about the properties acquired. Yes, the larger number, the details finally came through in terms of the processing, the primary healthcare facilities, and that they were then put into the books, if I could put it that way, of the Western Cape government onto our asset register. So they were free. We do not expropriate any buildings. We do expropriate land from a roads point of view, where necessary, property from a roads perspective, but we have not expropriated any buildings under the public works, from the public works point of view. Then, Chair, if with your indulgence, I would like to come back to Member Mvimbi's question about COVID at the end, because I could probably wax lyrical on what the team are doing, and I probably need to just get my mind framed correctly to be able to respond as succinctly as possible. But I would like to come back to that particular question with your indulgence. The questions then posed by Honourable Member America around the categorization, they do seem rather arbitrary. They are set from a Department of the Premier point of view in order to link up to the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation. So the underachieved, not achieved, underachieved, achieved and overachieved are set based upon those particular guidelines. And you're right, an overachievement is ultimately an achievement, but unfortunately we are required to report on it like that. And then the question about the outstanding debt and the 200% achievement side of things is that the target that was set for the outstanding debt was, we anticipated, obviously based upon our understanding of some of the clients and previous work and so on done, that in that particular instance, we were setting a target of an outstanding debt of only 7.2 million. However, the team were able to ultimately collect that particular debt from clients, and as a result, at the end of the 4th quarter, we only had 2.5 million rand outstanding in terms of debt. So as a result, you had the 281% performance, if I could put it that way. So we collected 4 million rand more than what we had anticipated we would be collecting in that 4th quarter. The points around the complaints of misuse and the crash and losses, and ultimately a lower percentage being better, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, a system just based on cold numbers doesn't actually give you that level of nuance, which is exactly as you raised, that in some instances where the indicator, where you underperform what the target is, it's actually a better performance. It actually is a better thing. Unfortunately, the system doesn't allow us to then say, well, in this instance, less than 100% is actually a better performance, and to color it green or ultimately dark blue. So you're quite right in your understanding, through you, Chair, to Honourable Member America, of your assessment of that particular indicator. The point about the completion of the designs in the first quarter of the year, obviously, when necessary, then those particular projects do come over into this particular financial year to complete the designs, have them ready. And I can say, linked potentially to Member Mvimbi's point around COVID, is that where we have had obviously teams working from home, working remotely, this has been a core part of their focus, is to make sure that we're able to bring up a number of projects, complete design work, complete the preparation of tender documents, etc., as well, based upon then this particular time that we've had under lockdown. Obviously, with a fair degree of uncertainty now from a financial point of view into this financial year, and the possibility of budgets being cut and so on, it could be that those projects that are now taken through the design phase to the point of being ready to go to tender may actually end up having to be shelved. It depends. We're not yet certain what the kind of financial implications are going to be for us from a department, and obviously generally from an infrastructure sector point of view and from a country point of view. Because we do understand the need to respond wholeheartedly, obviously, as much as possible to the COVID side. There are a number of questions posed around jobs, about the reporting, about the targets, and how the numbers stack up. And through you, Chair, if you allow me, I'm actually going to ask Advocate Smith if she wouldn't mind just to pick up on that particular question, just so that I can take a breath and have a sip of water, and then I'll pick up on the other aspects as well in terms of the questions. Thank you, Chair. If I may ask Advocate Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members. So I'm going to try and respond to that particular question. So firstly, we do report only on DTPW, EPWP created projects. The targets that you see there is set by national, and this is for the first year of the new phase of EPWP. So it is low, but it's for the first year of the new phase. So the way in which the targets was normally reported on was a combination of job opportunities and full-time equivalent. In other words, a full-time job for a particular person over a period of time, as opposed to an opportunity for a number of people, which could be repetitive. In the audit process the previous year, the AG then, the Auditor General then changed how they would like to see the calculation as well as the portfolio of evidence. In other words, when we talk about job opportunities, what would happen is we would go into a community based on the empowerment impact assessment, identify the kind of skills that we would have in the community. Let's say it's unskilled labor. And the same person over a period of time would get a number of jobs. Today they would push a wheelbarrow, tomorrow they would be responsible for cleaning the site, the next day they would be responsible for doing something else, and each one of those opportunities used to be counted as a separate opportunity. The AG changed the portfolio and said this is not how they want to see it reflected. Actually, that's one opportunity with one person over a period of time, and that's how they would like to see that method of calculation changing. Now, in accordance with the prescripts, the department then recognized the need to make representations to change the target for this indicator. Because of the method of calculation that had to change based on the improvement plan, that arose out of an audit process, which is the criteria for the change, the method of calculation and the corresponding portfolio of evidence that necessitates such a change. But the department responsible for effecting the change, which was the Provincial Treasury, did not do so, notwithstanding all of the substantiation and the proof that this is on recommendation of the Auditor General. The department was directed to merely explain the difference between the target and the reported performance. And as the HOD had indicated, had the department been allowed to change the target and to change the way in which we calculate the method of reporting, the achievement that you would have seen here would have been 67% for this quarter and 94% for the year to date. What you must also just note is that there's a direct link between projects, the number of projects that we either stop, and the jobs. So for the year under review in November, we were asked as a department to indicate a 300 million rand saving. In other words, stop projects to the value of 300 million rand that was not yet committed. This was on instruction of the National Treasury and implemented by the Provincial Treasury. We then had to cut several, if not all of the modernization projects not yet started at the time to the value of 300 million rand. In addition to that, we also had suffered quite a blow for 2 grade 9 contractors that basically went into business rescue and that were responsible for approximately 7 very large infrastructure projects. The one was Group 5, responsible for the implementation of about 3 schools projects. And the one was WTW, which was responsible for 4 major capital roads projects. All of these had a significant impact on the number of jobs created. That's it from my side, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Smith. HOD.
Thank you very much, Chair. If I may then continue with the other questions and also come back to the one that I have skipped over to last. There was then questions about the, I will come back to Member Heron's questions as well, if you don't mind, Chair, which are all linked to the COVID aspects around the Q&I aspects, the performance and the impact from the 4th quarter. I will pick those up. Then, and the transport capacity aspects. Through you, Chair, to Honourable Member Nkondlo, your question about the Mzansi Sizwe bursary program and how is there a facilitated exit strategy with the department? There is, absolutely. So the intention is, and what happens with the Mzansi Sizwe bursary program for us, is that there are bursars once they then graduate. There are a number of routes that they take. If they are linked to one of our bursary partners, then obviously they go and work for that particular company that they were linked to originally. If they were one of DPW's direct bursars, we look as far as possible to be able to take them up in our own department, first and foremost. And then they are linked to the professional development program that we've previously shared with the committee, where we then try to take the graduate through the next 3-4 years as a candidate, whether it's a candidate engineer or architect, quantity surveyor, all the way through to professional registration. As a candidate by law, they can only be appointed additional to the establishment on contract. And unfortunately, the law then does not allow us, even after all of that, to appoint the person permanently straight away into a vacant position. The person then, once they are professionally registered, is required to apply for a post, with a vacant post within the department. So unfortunately, we could find as a department that we have supported and invested obviously many years in training and skilling and developing somebody, and then potentially at the end of that professional, once they've got their professional registration, they may not able to be employed necessarily in the department if they are unsuccessful in terms of a vacant position that is advertised. Obviously, we do everything we can to make sure that we are able to appoint as many of our bursars and ultimately then professionally registered candidates as possible. For those that we are not able to then take up as candidates within the department, what we do is then link them as far as possible with other partners of the bursary program. So because we've got like these commitments that I spoke about and these undertakings, we've got a large network of contractors, professional consultants and so on that are often looking for the professional or the youngsters in terms of graduates. And we then have generally been well successful in making sure that the graduate is then placed with a company, offered a job, etc. Once again, if the committee would like, we could provide you again with an update in terms of the work of the Masaki Sizwe program. Obviously, if I may say, looking into the future and with where we are now, we have got the program at the current point in time in terms of the current financial year. But we are going to have to consider in terms of the impact from a construction and consulting engineering industry perspective, that there has been a number of companies that have downscaled. And so there are large numbers of those professionals now out in the field, in the sector, that are potentially available, remembering that Masaki Sizwe was originally started in order to help the department to be able to fill posts and build from within. And I do believe we have been incredibly successful in that regard in terms of the outcomes of that program for the department. Then the questions that were posed also linked to the electricity and the alternate energies and so on. We are obviously always looking and trying to understand what's going on from an alternate energy system and approach. We have put in place a what's called an ESCO contract as well, an electricity sharing contract with a private party that potentially they're able to come in, they implement certain measures in buildings, including behavior change and so on. And that then there's a sharing of the savings from what you would have been paying in terms of the cost for electricity or even for water, and that you then share in a pro rata contracted basis on the savings that are generated. So again, covered then in the property efficiency report that I mentioned earlier, we focus on and do have and continue to have an energy efficient drive. We have installed meters through the bulk of our buildings across the various floors, where we're able to track then through our resource champion and our maintenance teams if there's any spike. And automatic alerts are then sent out and issued for the maintenance teams to then go and see if there's a spike in consumption at a strange part of the day, both water and electricity, and that then allows us to direct our maintenance teams to respond to find out what's the problem, what's gone on, and what needs to be repaired. Then the point also, your question about the women and youth in terms of the targets, I did mention, and if I didn't, I apologize, the information isn't yet accessible from the various sites, the road sites, the construction sites, to be able to give that information. So it looks in terms of an underperformance, but we don't yet have the data in order to validate the performance. So that's why that information looks out of kilter in terms of the performance targets. So it's because we don't have that information to be able to give you, unfortunately, an accurate response in terms of the performance. The REU question, Chair, we contributed in the last financial year, if my memory serves me correctly, in the region of 16 million rand. So that was our contribution. PRASA and the city all had to make a contribution towards the REU. And then also, as we presented to this committee, when we presented our budget for the current financial year for 2020-21, there was also a provision to be made in terms of a transfer to the city to further the work and continue the program in terms of the REU with PRASA. If I may now come to the questions about COVID and the impact on the department, and what we've been doing in terms of getting involved, what are our challenges and so on. I I suppose I have to start where before lockdown occurred, obviously the first impact for us from a departmental point of view and our direct service delivery aspects were in relation to our provincial traffic team. So there certainly then became an impact for a need to procure PPE to make sure that our officers were kept safe when they were performing their patrol duties and the roadblocks and so on. So we were required to ensure that they had the necessary masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, thermometers, temperature tests, and so on. That also then became a requirement a little bit later on, of course, in terms of the regulations. But up front, it was around the PPE. And needing to make sure that our officers understood what sort of protocols to follow, how do they approach a motorist. So there were also interactions with the Department of Health at the time, because there were then concerns raised, as you may recall, around doing breath alcohol testing and what the implications were. So we then also took the decision at that point to halt breath alcohol testing, but that did not mean that if anybody was suspected as driving, being over the influence, being over the limit, under the influence when they were driving, that they would then be taken by a provincial traffic officer to the nearest hospital and have blood drawn, as it was before we had the breath testing in place. So that was for us an immediate need. And that, of course, meant that our team, members of Advocate Smith, Chantel Smith's team, from a procurement point of view and finance, we had to move very, very quickly in order to provide that response and the kind of support that to be able to make sure that our staff felt, while getting anxious, obviously felt a little bit more at ease, that as the department, as the employer, we do care about them. We are trying to make sure that they are looked after and that we understand that their health is of vital importance. We also took the decision at the time to then start to decongest the building. So putting in place a business continuity plan for the department to start to reduce the number of people within the building at any given point in time, to work on shifts, to work in particular groups, so that we then also potentially limit the impact should somebody become infected, that then potentially that group of people in terms of the shift would then obviously all have to be quarantined, but it doesn't mean that the whole team is, that there are still people available to continue with the work. We put in place measures around emergency procurement. I gave the necessary authorizations from a procurement point of view. The necessary delegations are in place within the department. We put in place the requirements around data usage, telephone usage, etc., being able to take the asset in terms of your computer home to be able to work remotely. All of those quite mundane, almost administrative matters were also dealt with. And then where particular we moved into the lockdown phase, and as provided for in terms of DPSA requirements and others, we then put in place the necessary procedures for people to be put on special leave or whatever may be required from a work perspective. COVID obviously then meant that the transport team, particularly in responding to the various directions and limitations placed on public transport, we had to work together and still do work together with the City of Cape Town, engage with the various operators. So we interacted with the Golden Arrow bus services, obviously with Santaco, through the city with the MyCity team. There were some interactions obviously with some of the e-hailing organizations. To understand, remember, under lockdown 5, there was only certain hours that public transport was allowed to operate. And that then meant that the team needed to now respond in terms of the regulatory requirements, working with the city for surveyors to go out to interchanges, putting in place technology options that we've been able to repurpose the investment that we'd already made in the traffic and transport technology that we have. Certainly in the George situation, and even here with provincial traffic, we've been able to adjust, reuse, and reconfigure So we've been able to use a lot of what we've invested over the last few years in helping us to respond, gather information from passengers, complaints, and so on. We've obviously, as a team, also working with the city, been sending communications up to the National Department, queries, concerns about the regulations. We made some proposals to the National Department of Transport, one which was called the Blue Dot, where we actually felt that in order to support the minibus taxi industry specifically and try to maintain a capacity limitation of 50% at the time, that government should actually enter into a type of service contract with the industry, and we called it Blue Dot. It would allow us to put trackers in, the necessary monitoring mechanisms and so on, and that in that way support the industry, number one, financially, and also bring in elements that obviously are part of a longer term plan, helping the industry as well. Unfortunately, the National Department have never responded to that particular proposal that we made, and we felt that one may be able to direct some of the operations grant money potentially to be able to fund it. But that still remains what we believe to be a potential solution for some of the aspects and complexities that we believe are inherent within the public transport system. There's obviously other aspects. The team, from a transport point of view, have been supporting the Department of Health now. In the last round, when we moved to level 4, and with the curfew and the reduction in operating hours, or the limitation in operating hours of public transport to 7 o'clock at the time, we then utilized what we had then called a red dot transport system, also with the minibus taxi industry, and you would have seen the minister launching that. I think it was last week. Time is going by so quickly now, that we have then taken part of that particular service and at the moment purposed it to respond to the needs of the healthcare workers, to make sure that they're able to get home, those whose shifts end at 7 o'clock. I know that the regulation has changed and allows public transport to now operate until 8, but the Department of Health has asked us just to keep that particular service in place, and is serving a few hundred healthcare workers at the moment from the key hospital facilities home in the evening in vehicles that are sanitized, that the nurses or healthcare staff themselves are required to ensure that they're wearing masks, and due process from a health and safety point of view is followed. We then also have to understand, when the question was asked around quarantine and isolation and other parts of what the department has been doing. So we were towards the back end of the last financial year, then at the back end of the fourth quarter, moving into this one, asked to start to identify potential facilities to be used for quarantine and isolation sites. Now, the regulations have been vague-ish, if I may put it that way, that it says that the National Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure must identify facilities. We are required to identify facilities. A municipality is required to identify facilities. And then a guideline issued by National says that the Department of Health is required to operationalize the facilities. And in engaging with the Department of Health from a provincial point of view for quarantine and isolation, we obviously offered our support to them so that they can focus their time and attention on responding to hospital requirements and so on. And as a result, we have landed up then taking on and working with the Department of Health around assessing potential facilities, and then also providing the necessary support where required to put those facilities into operation, working with the Department of Health, with the municipality concerned, or even some of the, obviously the private sector, where we've got some of the facilities that have been hired from them. Then also within the infrastructure space, of course, supporting the Department of Health with some of their bed requirements, so the CTICC, and the hiring of that facility for the Department of Health, and a couple of others, obviously, and really trying to respond from whatever capacity and expertise our department has to be able to help the health team and to reduce some of the burden on their shoulders. I think we'd all agree that responding to COVID is not just a health response, it's required from each and every single one of us. The questions posed about the work linked to the capacity constraints and how we're responding. So our team is now, between ourselves, the city and PRASA, who've come on board, have done a fair amount of work previously between city and province, providing submissions to national about level 3 and the potential implications from a capacity point of view. And we are continuing that to try to understand what is available, how we approach it, acknowledging that there's different modes that play a different role in each space. But at the same time, we do need to still convey the message and carry through the message, as was mentioned by our president as well, that we must still try wherever possible to work from home. So while the sectors of the economy obviously will be open under level 3, wherever possible, we should still be advocating for alternate work hours, working from home, flexible work hours, etc. Because I don't think any of us really want to see a return to normal from that point of view, the congestion, etc. This is the ideal opportunity to take the lessons learned, the experience that we have, and try to ensure that those organizations, companies, even the provincial government that was potentially hesitant with the concept of working remotely, that we shouldn't then necessarily just think that we can go back or should be going back to prior COVID. We should be able to carry those practices through into the new normal. The key thing, if I may say, Chair, then in conclusion for us around COVID is that the response required for the Department of Health, for our department in terms of Q&I and others, while we acknowledge that it's all part of the health response, it obviously has severe and fundamental budget implications. And obviously, members of the committee, and you would have seen and discussed, I'm assuming, with your colleagues in terms of other committee presentations, the province itself and national government sits with quite a conundrum and a difficult situation in terms of the economy and where on earth we're going to be finding the money to be able to fund the COVID response. So certainly I must flag my concern that as a department, if we think about it, as a department, we have a relatively large budget, not in line obviously with what health or education have, but we have a relatively large budget. The main, of course, is earmarked and directed from an infrastructure perspective. And so certainly I am concerned that we could find ourselves as a department having to halt projects or be required to fundamentally cut budgets in order to direct that money to the COVID response. And so whatever we've put on the table for the 2021 financial year in terms of our plan and our targets, I think everybody would understand is going to be fundamentally changed post-COVID. But we certainly are likely to feel or experience a substantial financial impact in this department, given the nature of potentially its budget being able to be cut, if I could use those terms, because there are projects that there's a perception, well, you just delay the projects. But as one of the questions was earlier around maintenance, for example, that's really the last thing that we should be doing, is delaying aspects around maintenance. And there is a need to ensure particularly that the sector of the economy is still supported with some projects and work, etc., from the provincial government. Chair, I think I've spoken way too much, and for that I sincerely apologize to you and to the members of the committee, but I trust I have answered the questions posed. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, HOD, for that comprehensive response. Members, we have 13 minutes to 4, and this meeting is only scheduled till 4, but I'm going to allow you an opportunity if you have any follow-ups. Unfortunately, we won't have time for new questions, but if there's any follow-ups, I'm going to entertain those. If you can just raise your hand if you have.
Chair van der Westhuizen, I don't see my option to raise my hand.
All right. So it's Honourable Nkondlo, Honourable Heron, Honourable Mvimbi, and then Honourable van der Westhuizen. Members, can I please ask that you work with me and that you pose it in 1 minute, please. Honourable Nkondlo.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Actually, I'm going to be very short. One, I just wanted to say I really appreciate this initiative of the department. I forgot the name. HOD spoke about the contract with the Taxi Association. I think we must commend, I think, that innovation that you did, considering the impact, of COVID to the industry and some of the challenges and trust deficit in the work that has been happening. I think for me, that is quite a huge innovation, which I would like to really commend the department on. And I think on the issue HOD raises about budget, I also wish to concur that I'm not sure what we exactly have issues there, but my point is the budget for COVID-19. I think part of what we need to ensure we push and seek to achieve is the balance between the social relief and to keep the economy, especially in terms of infrastructure. That is also one of the biggest challenges. If you look at the base of what is the spread in the hotspot is poor infrastructure in those areas. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honourable Heron.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to follow up on the target setting for the EPWP work opportunities or full-time equivalents. Is the contracts that the department have with construction with the construction industry, do they not include a compulsory portion to be spent on local labour and thus EPWP opportunities? I didn't quite understand the answer that the targets were set by national government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Honourable Mvimbi.
Thank you, Chairperson. Just to follow up on the service of I think it's called the Red Dot, if I got it correctly, where there's this public transport services that is available after 8 o'clock that the HOD has spoken about. I just want to check whether, firstly, is it in all the regions, in other words, all the district of the Western Cape, and then also does it also, because I've heard some of the taxi operators saying that it also operates as an ambulance as well. Is that the case? Thanks very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honourable Mvimbi. Honourable van der Westhuizen.
Thank you, Chair. Follow up in response or on one of the responses. Some of the large construction companies that have been put under business rescue has since applied for liquidation. Can I just ask, how would that affect some of the capital projects or some of the maintenance projects in the province?
Thank you very much. Honourable van der Westhuizen, HOD, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the follow-up questions. So I note and thank very much Honourable Member Nkondlo for your points and for the acknowledgement. The team have been hard at work and really are doing a stellar job. The points, if I may, then to get to Honourable Member Heron around the target setting. So you're right, within our projects, so remember, you're quite correct that within our contracts, we do set targets that the contractors are required to meet in terms of local labour, suppliers, etc., etc. So those are in our contracts that are required to be met by each of the contractors. And that's based particularly on the projects more than 5 million where the empowerment impact assessment is undertaken. The point about the low target setting, what the CFO tried to explain was that there's a relatively low target because of this being overall, let's say, if you add up all of the pieces for the department, overall low target because it's the first year of the new 5-year EPWP programs. So National sets a lowish target in the first year and then ramps it up in order to achieve the overall X many million work opportunities across the country. So that's what she was trying to explain, but you're quite right that there are targets set within the contracts. The red dot, it is available across, so its original design and intention is to be utilized as a transport service to be able to transport people to quarantine and isolation sites. Up until now, the Department of Health have used their HealthNet service, which of course, they then, when things start getting rather heavy for them, their HealthNet service is unable to then act as the equivalent of really a public a transport service to transport somebody to a quarantine or isolation site. So the concept of an ambulance is not quite an ambulance. It's still a transport vehicle, but to get somebody to a Q&I. Because there isn't yet that demand in terms of moving people to Q&I just yet, that we anticipate is ramping up as the pandemic increases. We were able to then, when the Department of Health identified this need with their health workers, with the nurses, we were able to then say to them, look, we've already got this particular system in place, and we can then utilize this in the interim to be able to assist you in terms of responding to the requirements for your health workers. So it's a secondary aspect ultimately in terms of the health workers, and its intention in terms of the Q&I is that it's across the province and operational across the regions wherever necessary. We've started it with only a few vehicles, and as we need to, we will bring more vehicles on stream. And then the last question about the companies going to business rescue and then into liquidation. I'll ask the CFO just to confirm for me, but to my knowledge, we were actually able to then terminate the contracts before, where necessary, before companies gone into liquidation, so that we don't stand with our project now caught in the process of the company being liquidated. I believe we were able to do that. We've learned some hard lessons from previous projects. So Advocate Smith, could you just confirm for me if I'm giving the right information, please?
Actually, that's correct. But the member's question also related to how that in the main affect maintenance. And the answer is that it wouldn't, because the contractors in question did not have maintenance contracts with us at this particular point in time. Those were large capital projects that they were dealing with.
Thank you, Chair. I believe we've answered the questions followed up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, HOD, to you and your department for, again, for the manner in which we could engage. Thank you for the presentation and the preparation amongst everything else that you are busy with. So on behalf of the committee, thank you very much. And if you're more than welcome to stay for the committee admin, but you are free to leave. You and the officials. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to you and to members of the committee. Much appreciated, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Members, if I've posted on the chat group, if we could please just stay behind to conclude the committee admin. So we will run over because we have some old minutes that needs to be adopted. Is everyone in agreement with that?
Fine with me, Chair.
Thank you. Honourable Heron.
No, I said that's fine. Thank you.
All right.
No
Thank
problem,
you very much,
Chairperson.
members. Thank you, Honourable Mvimbi. Okay, members, I'm going to not take up much time, so I'm going to go straight into the minutes of the 27th of November. I take it that everyone has received and read the minutes, so I'm not going to ask the procedural officer to put it on the screen. I'm going to table page 1, any edits or amendments. Page 2, any edits or amendments. If there's no edits or amendments, I then table the minutes of the 27th of November. Is there a proposer and a seconder?
I propose, Chair, that we adopt the minutes.
Were they on the screen, Chairperson?
No, Honourable Mvimbe, I said I didn't ask the.
Oh, okay.
I'm
No
not
problem.
asking the procedural officer, but if you would like, I can do that.
No. It's fine, Chair. It's fine.
Okay. Honourable America.
Yes,
I propose, Chair, that we adopt.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable America.
Seconded.
I will second.
Thank you very much, members. We move over to the minutes of the 17th of March, page 1, any edits or amendments. Page 2, any edits or amendments. If no edits or amendments, I table the minutes of the 17th of March for adoption.
Agreed to.
Thank you, Honourable Van der Westhuizen. Is there a seconder?
Seconded.
Thank you very much, Honourable Mvimbe. Right, thank you, members. We move on to the quarterly report of the procedural officer must just assist here. It's dated July 2019 to September 2019, but I think it needs to be October to December, if I'm not mistaken. Johan?
Chairperson, that's correct. I've picked it up and I have corrected it already. And I just not to confuse members, I didn't want to send it out again, but I have picked up the period was wrong, so I did fix it.
All right, thank you. Can I just, in the interest of all members, if you could please just flight the attendance registers on the screen. So I'm not the entire report, just the attendance registers of both quarterly reports, please. When we get to that page. Johan, would that be good?
Here we go, Chairperson. Can you see?
Yes, we can see. Thank you. So, okay, so yeah, let's just go to the attendance register. Members, can you please just check your attendance register before I officially table the report? Okay. Page 1 with the edits of October 2019 to December 2019. Page 2, any edits or amendments? Page 3, any edits or amendments? Page 4, any edits or amendments? Page 5, any edits or amendments? Page 6, any edits or amendments? Page 7, any edits or amendments? Page 8, any edits or amendments? If no edits or amendments, I table the quarterly report for October 2019 to December 2019 for adoption.
Chair van der Westhuizen, I propose that we adopt with that amendment in the dates as originally circulated.
Thank you very much, Honourable van der Westhuizen.
Seconded, Chair. Derek.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable America. Members, we move on to the quarterly report for January 2020 to March 2020. While Mr. Kutsia is putting it onto the screen, I'm going to go to page 1, any edits or amendments. Page 2, any edits or amendments. Page 3, any edits or amendments. Okay, We're at page 4 now with the members' attendance. Johan, if you could just put the members' attendance on so that everyone can just have a look. Chairperson. That's the January one.
Okay. Chairperson, there it is.
Thank you very much. Page 4, any edits or amendments, members? Honorable America, are you saying something?
No.
All right.
Then we can proceed.
Page 5, any edits or amendments? Page 6, any edits or amendments? Page 7, any edits or amendments? If no edits or amendments, I table the quarterly report for January 2020 to March 2020 for adoption.
I propose we adopt, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable America and Honorable Van der
I will
Westhuizen.
second them.
Thank you. Members, we're nearly there. We move over to the report on the annual report of the Standing Committee on Transport and Public Works for 2019-2020 financial year. Page 1, any edits or amendments? Page 2, any edits or amendments? And then page 3, any edits or amendments? If no edits or amendments, I table the report for adoption.
Propose we adopt, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable America.
I will second that.
Thank you, Honorable Van der Westhuizen.
Second it.
Thank you very much. And then the last report, members, is the Standing Committee's oversight visit to the Mitchells Plain train station on the 19th of February. Page 1, any edits or amendments? And page 2, any edits or amendments? If no edits or amendments, I table for adoption.
I propose we adopt, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable America.
I will second that, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Van der Westhuizen. Okay, members, thank you very much. We are at item number 4 of the agenda. Members, we have gone over past 4 o'clock already. Can I ask, with your indulgence, that if there's anything or any additional information or resolutions that emanate from this meeting, that you put it in writing to the procedural officer? Will that be in order with everyone?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable. Thank you very much, members. Members, if there's nothing else, thank you very much for this meeting.